Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program, Racism in America, Voices of Asian Americans. I'd like to start by thanking our generous sponsors for tonight's program. Our presenting sponsor, Texas Instruments. The Texas Instruments Foundation has given the museum a landmark gift to support programming to confront anti-Asian hate and bigotry. We are so grateful for their ongoing dedication to educate the community about and to confront anti-Asian American hate speech and violence. And our event sponsor, Rich Results. Thank you so much for your support of the museum and this important program. I'd also like to extend thanks to our community partners for tonight's event. We have quite a list, so bear with me. Aaron Family JCC, Community Foundation of Texas, Crow Museum of Asian Art at the University of Texas at Dallas, Dallas Video Fest, Human Rights Campaign, Dallas-Fort Worth, Japan America Society of Dallas-Fort Worth, Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Services, Orchid Giving Circle, Refugee Services of Texas, Southwest Jewish Congress, Temple Shalom, and World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Thank you so much for your support and partnership. We are very grateful. And as always, I'd like to give a warm welcome to our museum members and our board members. Your support is so crucial to our mission. Over the past year and a half, we've seen an alarming increase in violence and hatred directed at Asian Americans. At the museum, we aim to create meaningful change through education by rooting ourselves in history, highlighting personal stories, and celebrating upstanders. History teaches us that discrimination against Asian Americans in this country, unfortunately, is nothing new, but we cannot stand by as racism continues to take its toll on our communities. Tonight, we will hear about the individual impact of racism. At the museum, we are committed to addressing this longstanding discrimination in our permanent exhibition, in our rotating special exhibitions, and through public programs like this one tonight. We know tonight's program can only scratch the surface, so we plan to explore this complex topic further in our 2022 Crucial Conversation series, which will focus on the history of anti-Asian discrimination in the United States and its modern day implications. The series will coincide with our spring 2022 special exhibition, Courage and Compassion, our shared story of the Japanese American World War II experience, which chronicles the stories of Japanese Americans during and after World War II. And we hope that at any time you visit the museum, you will explore our Pivot to America wing, where you can learn about the histories of different groups in the United States who have fought for equal treatment, including Asian Americans. Though tonight's program focuses on personal experiences, we wanted to provide some historical context from our Pivot to America wing before we begin. It is now my pleasure to welcome Julia Wada, Group Vice President for Toyota and Museum Board Member, to share some of this history.
Thank you, Mary Pat. Tonight, I would like to share with you a few highlights from the Asian American rights strand in the museum's Pivot to America wing. These strands provide interactive histories of 12 different groups in America as they work to bring the reality of their lives more closely into accord with our country's foundational ideals. The American ideal we point to in the museum when discussing Asian American rights is the statement in our Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and by this we mean all people. From America's founding, Asian Americans faced discriminatory laws, had their freedoms limited, and were prohibited from entering the United States. As this evening's program will show, today's diverse Asian American community continues to fight for their rights and against prejudice and hatred, and to celebrate their contributions to American history and culture. To begin, I'd like to note that the first Asians to settle in America were Filipino sailors who settled in the New Orleans area in 1763, before American independence from Britain. Over a century later, in 1867, there was a landmark strike by Chinese workers against their employer, the Central Pacific Railroad. Approximately 20,000 male Chinese laborers were brought to the US in the mid-19th century, and many found work in the Transcontinental Railroad project, meant to knit this nation together. They worked on the western half of the project, and Irish immigrants worked on the eastern half. In 1867, 2,000 Chinese laborers went on strike over dangerous conditions and low wages. Their strike only lasted for 1 week, as the Central Pacific Railroad starved them into submission. Still, their actions marked an important milestone in their efforts to obtain equal rights in America. In 1882, the US passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in response to growing anti-Chinese sentiment, mainly in the West. This was the first time that a particular racial group was singled out and forbidden from immigrating to the United States. Chinese laborers were the chief targets of the act. In the 20th century, Richard J. Walsh, husband of author and activist Pearl S. Buck, founded the Citizens Committee to repeal Chinese exclusion to fight against the act, which was finally repealed in 1943. The path to US citizenship for Asians and Asian Americans in the 19th and early 20th centuries was difficult and often impossible. In 1913, Bhagat Singh Thind came from India to study. In 1918, he enlisted in the US military to fight in World War I. Honorably discharged, he sought to become an American citizen. In 1923, in US versus Bhagat Singh Thind, the US Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Asian Indians were not white and therefore were not eligible for US citizenship. Approximately 50 Asians who had previously received US citizenship were denaturalized because of the case. In 1935, Congress passed the Inoue Act, making all World War I veterans eligible for citizenship regardless of race, and then became a citizen. But Asian Americans were far from protected at this point. In 1942, in the wake of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, some military officials, as well as white Americans, feared possible Japanese sabotage or espionage on the West Coast. In response, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, allowing the military to create exclusion zones on the West Coast. This resulted in the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals in internment camps. And conditions in the camps were very harsh and life was difficult. My father, who was an American citizen, born and raised in California, was 12 at the time, and he and his family were incarcerated in the Gila River camp in Arizona. It's a time in his life that he rarely talked about. In 1943, in the face of this blatant racism, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was formed. It was made up of Japanese American volunteers, many of whose parents and families were held in the internment camps. The 442nd, whose motto was "Go for Broke," fought heroically in the European theater from 1944, rescued the Lost Battalion, a Texas National Guard division in France, and helped liberate Dachau concentration camp, as well as survivors on a death march. For its size and length of service, the 442nd was the most highly decorated in US history, including 21 Medal of Honor recipients. One of those recipients, Daniel Inoue, lost his right arm to a grenade during the war. He went on to become the first Japanese American congressman in 1959 and the first Japanese American US senator in 1963. Senator Inoue spent his life in service as an advocate for Japanese American rights. In the last part of the 20th century, we start to see major steps in the repair process. The passage of the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 abolished the national origins formula. This meant that the national origin of prospective immigrants could no longer factor into decisions. This eased the path to America for Asians, Africans, and Southern and Eastern Europeans. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously stated, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act into law. The act provided $20,000 in reparations to all living Japanese Americans who had been interned by the US government. It also provided a formal presidential apology for US actions against Japanese Americans during World War II. Many Japanese Americans worked for redress in the years after their internment. Aiko Herzog Yoshinaga, who was interned as a child, spent years researching the wartime internment in the Federal Archives. She ultimately located the original US military report that stated that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was not a military necessity. This was an incredibly important discovery because the internment was always justified on the basis of being militarily needed. Herzog Yoshinaga's work was central to the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. As I noted earlier, what I've shared here is just a brief highlight tour of the Asian American Rights Interactive Strand in the museum's Pivot to America wing. My hope is that you will visit the museum to explore Asian American rights in more depth, as well as the historical development of the rights of 11 other groups of Americans that we feature in this wing. Mary Pat?
Thank you so much, Julia. And thankfully, I have my camera on this time. You would think that after all this time, I would have figured out Zoom. Thank you for your patience. Tonight, we wanted to create a space to share the individual impact of hatred and discrimination. We deeply appreciate our panelists for sharing their time, energy, and perspectives with us. I want to leave as much time as possible for tonight's discussion, so I will briefly introduce our speakers. First, Tammy Nguyen Lee is an award-winning film and television producer, director, on-camera talent, philanthropist, and co-founder of Against the Grain Productions. A first-generation Vietnamese American, she and her mom came to the United States as boat people refugees, ultimately settling in Garland, Texas. Xiaofan is a product line manager at Texas Instruments, leading the company's clock and timing business. Xiaofan grew up in Beijing, China, and immigrated to the US during college, where he attended Texas A&M University. Anna Swan is the founder and chef of the Dallas pop-up, Inoue. As a first-generation Filipino-American, Anna not only serves up delicious Filipino food to the great people of Dallas, but also shares her family's culture and background through Inoue. And Cynthia Young is president of the Boone Family Foundation. Cynthia is founding chair of the Orchid Giving Circle, Asian Women Caring and Sharing, a fund at the Texas Women's Foundation supported by 60 plus women committed to raising funds for community grants that serve Asians in North Texas. And I'm delighted that tonight's conversation is moderated by Sylvia Kamatsu, Chief Content and Diversity Officer for KERA. Sylvia is responsible for content on all of KERA's digital, radio, and television platforms and oversees diversity and inclusion efforts across the organization. We will leave time for questions at the end of tonight's program, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. And now I would like to turn things over to Sylvia, Tammy, Xiaofan, Anna, and Cynthia.
Well, thank you so much for the introductions, Mary Pat, and thank you also to Julia for providing that really important historical context for tonight's conversation. We so appreciate the museum creating this space to elevate Asian American voices tonight, so thank you. And welcome to all of our panelists. Well, as we know, over this past year, the country has seen a surge in harassment and violence against Asian Americans, everything from children being bullied to people being pushed and beaten, homes, businesses, public spaces being vandalized with phrases like kill all Chinese people. We've been going through a lot this last year. So I'll start out with just a really basic question. Could you share how you're feeling right now, given everything that we were going through? Who'd like to start us off? Tammy?
I can start. This has been an interesting year because as many of you who follow the media saw in the past years, we were kind of on a high. For those of us who were cheering on Crazy Rich Asians and this wave of great roles and movies coming out for Asian Americans, all of a sudden I felt knocked on my feet for someone who has been an advocate for our cultural experience and identity for probably more than half my life, I felt not invisible, but almost overexposed and oversensitive. Like I had a spidey sense around me as to if I needed to protect myself and my children. And I had never truly felt that sense of fear before, because I felt like a target walking out of my house. And before, I had a certain sense of pride, even though that I knew not everyone understood about us, but now I felt misunderstood and identified as the enemy, more than just the other, but the enemy. And it felt very different this past year. It was scary, very scary.
And Tammy, did anything happen to you personally along the way?
For me, my family is close. My parents are close by and I have young children. We took the very proactive approach and we kind of dug deep and stayed inside because we wanted to be, to protect ourselves. My husband is ex-military and he's much more reserved and protective of our family than I would normally be. And I had to listen to his advice for not just COVID reasons, but as we saw these different acts happening around the country, for own personal safety. And I'm much more of a Pollyanna when it comes to being hopeful about people. But when the question is posed, will I be willing to risk my children? The answer was always no. And so I got risk averse this past year and avoided as many interactions as I could in the public. But we tried to identify allies and friends that we could connect with in a safe virtual space or on our home turf, where we had a little bit more control over if something positive, something potentially negative could happen. But we tried our best to kind of lay low this year just to avoid it all.
Did anyone else feel that fear?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Tammy speaks for all of us in this new sense of fear that we feel. I think as the pandemic started, you know, a lot of the action was around Black Lives Movement and, you know, the marching and how marchers were being targeted. And I know that I felt a lot of fear then about what was happening and shifting in our country, and also that words matter. And early in the pandemic, there were some very ugly words used to describe COVID. And those words matter. People act on words. And so I felt really unsafe from the beginning. I didn't feel that I could go march as an ally. And then I felt like I couldn't even really leave the house without knowing if somebody randomly was going to do something. And as things escalated, I mean, it got much, much worse. And I remember after the Atlanta murders, I didn't want to leave the house. And my friends with parents like were so frightened and worried. So it feels like we've all been holding our breath, waiting for something to happen, whether it happens or not. But that fear, you know, permeates your body. And, you know, my friends say like it just froze us in so many ways because we just had this fear. And, you know, I had really wonderful friends that offered to be my white ally and go with me anywhere so I wouldn't have to be alone. And I had friends, you know, tell me about which pepper spray to buy. That is not how I want to live, or have I ever thought about physical violence. I've had, you know, verbal slurs and things like that throughout my life, but never has it been to this level of just, you just feel it in your body and you're watching. And I like know, like when I walk, I shouldn't be on my phone. Like I should be paying attention to everyone around me. And that's new. That's new.
Anna and Xiaofan, how have you been personally impacted?
For me, I think since the beginning of this year, it's been like very high-low emotions, especially as more reports of the anti-Asian attacks started coming through, or just becoming more aware of it. And for me, it hit home because I'm from the Bay Area and a lot of the attacks were happening there. And all of my family on my mom's side, they're pretty much all there. So the fact that I would sometimes text my mom, and because she lives alone, I would just ask her, like, please be careful when you go out by yourself, or have one of the cousins accompany you if you have to go out. And luckily she's aware, and she's like pretty cautious too. She's like, no, I don't go out. I just have things delivered. But the fact that like it brought me to that point of literally having to worry about her safety, our safety, the rest of my family's safety, like just because of something that's really, it shouldn't even be an issue. And I think like early last year, and just like what Cynthia had said, just hearing all the things that people were calling COVID, China virus, Kung flu, and then like she said, words matter and people do act on that. And if our own president at the time is saying those things, then yeah, people are going to follow suit. And that was really disheartening at the fact that some people didn't realize the impact of 4 words and what it can do to an entire community. So for me, like it's been pretty emotional, and luckily my husband is Caucasian, so I feel okay going out. But if I do have to go out by myself, I'm kind of hesitant, or just I tend to make sure I have someone with me. And then the fact that a friend, before I went home to California a month ago, she teaches like Filipino martial arts. And she was like, do you want to do a quick lesson before you go home, just for your safety in case anything happens? And I said to her, I was like, yeah, and I'm really sad that we have to think about that. So never before have I had to like have it in the back of my mind that something could happen over something that we don't really have direct involvement with.
Xiaofan, what about you? You spent several years here in North Texas. You're now in California, right, in the Santa Clara area. So how has this been for you this last year?
Yeah, I would say it's very complicated. It's kind of a progression of different emotions. When all those things first happen, of course, you watch all this news and senseless attack is anger. Then you start seeing more and more of those events happening, and start reading more about those stories and kind of reading into the history, become more saddened that a lot of those things continue to repeat itself, right? Watching the histories repeat on its own. And then start having more conversations with my wife, with my friends and colleagues. The same question keep coming up, is that, do we still want to continue to stay in America? And because I think for my wife and I, and a lot of my friends, actually, we came to the United States in our 20s to pursue higher education or for work. And just like most of actually Asian American, as a fact, 60% Asian American are foreign born. And so we chose to come to this country actually to pursue better opportunities, to actually come because we believe in the value of this country. And so I believe, I think choosing to leave is not the solution to this problem. And so we have to actually face it up front. And now where I'm at is actually, I cannot just continue to be on the sideline and watch all this happening in a silent way. And I have to speak up, right? As one of this fastest growing ethnic group in the United States, I have a responsibility and also have the rights and the voice to speak up. So that's why I'm actually taking the step to actually be here today, and extremely honored to be given this opportunity.
I wonder if each of you could share more as well, just about what some of your other friends and families have been feeling, and have you been noticing some generational differences in terms of responses to what's going on?
Yeah, so I think one of my friends, she lives here in the Bay Area. I think she shared with me kind of at the beginning of the pandemic, when she was going into the hospital and wearing a mask. I think at that time, the beginning, the mask mandate from CDC was not given out yet. And so then she actually heard someone at the hospital that worked there and whispered, "Oh, look at her, she has the China virus." And so at that time, then she didn't really react, and she looked at her, and then everybody else also looked at her in a very strange way, and then she kind of just let things go, and then she didn't really fight or speak up. And so that's kind of representative to a lot of us, right? I think we experience those type of racism or kind of bias actions, and then we tend to just normalize and move on, and then we don't really fight for our right or speak up and stand up to those things. And no one actually, when that happened, no one actually spoke up against that voice. And so I think that's what a lot of us, and I think especially kind of what others have shared in the older generation, my family, both my wife's and my mom's families are here. And so they actually more afraid of going out, right? So as a result of all this.
Anyone else want to share their thoughts on that?
I know in
Yeah.
talking with a couple of friends, they were having not trouble, but they weren't sure how to process everything happening and how to speak up about it. And these are Asian Americans as well. And I think maybe a lot of us who were born in America and growing up as Asian Americans, we weren't sure how to process it. And I think a lot of it has to do with, as an Asian community, we're kind of told like, don't ruffle any feathers, don't cause trouble, kind of keep your head down, work hard, and then you'll make your way through this country and rise up in the ranks in corporate America or whatever. And I think we were just kind of conditioned. And even my immigrant parents have said, like, you know, when you grow up, get a job, work hard, and then you'll be promoted. And I have quickly learned that's not the case. So kind of like what Xiaofan was saying, like now it's time to speak up. Like we can't just kind of sit back and observe anymore. Now it's just time for us to use our voice, which I don't know that much in our community is used to doing.
Tammy and Cynthia, I'm curious how you would respond to what Anna just said, that there is this pressure to keep your head down and to not say anything. And at the same time, as we know, there's a very pervasive model minority myth, right? Which has served as a real racial wedge between the Asian American Pacific Islander community and other communities. And would love your thoughts on that, because my sense is that you have run into that in your lives and careers. So tell me more about how you personally experienced that and what you've done about it.
I think this might speak to my age, but I feel like we battled this a lot when I was younger. And I was lucky in that I grew up with a mother who was bicultural, and that we were first generation, and she came here as that very much burdened by that model minority, demure, female, but at the same time, very strong-minded, very assertive, and very smart. And she quickly learned, trying to climb the corporate ladder, that she had to assert her voice in a different way than if she had in her home country. And I think that permeated throughout our family. And so for me, being someone who learned to have a voice and being strong enough and confident enough to do that came early. I know that that is our burden as a culture and community, but with having started against the grain and knowing that in the back of my mind for so long, it became sort of a mantra that basically any one part of our tribe would be an upstander. So we've been very familiar with this for probably the last 15 years. And it's just sad that it came to this to galvanize us in this year, in this time, on the heels of Black Lives Matter, to get us mad enough to come together. And I feel like this has come in waves. If you've looked at the history of what we were presented at the beginning of what has happened to different parts of our ethnicity over 100 years, but nothing got us mad enough to unite, not enough. And finally, I feel like being surrounded by people like Cynthia and so many friends who are in Orchid Giving Circle, so many different Asian professional organizations that had been the forefront of advocacy, they got mad enough and they immediately responded. And seeing a lot of these organizations get mad enough to unite, I think is what we needed. Because for years now, we've been trying to get, Sylvia, as you know, from a media perspective, our stories told. And we've had various networks that came and then went because we could not get a united voice. And unfortunately, it came down to some pinpoint, horrible, violent acts in our country to make us all unite. And we got knocked down enough where we said, that's enough. And I think Atlanta had a lot to do with that. And it was a very tragic event, but it was, I feel like looking back in history, we'll see that as an event that galvanized our community to get up and speak up. So in many ways, I know that we were taught not to, but I think that happened hard enough and at a time when then those of us who were used to not speaking up were ready to. The rest of us who've been at the forefront finally got some teammates, I feel like, to fight the fight.
Cynthia?
All right. I really support what Tammy says. This moment, however awful it is, I think has finally awakened the bigger community that the silent strategy is not going to work. It's very different now. And, you know, I have been fighting against the culture that I was brought up in, and I think is pervasive in Asia, is that it's a very male-dominated culture, very patriarchal. Children listen to parents, and there is not a lot of pushing back on anything. And so I know I grew up like, why do girls have to do this, and why can't we do that? And I think I'm really lucky in this time and space to have so many incredible Asian girlfriends and you know, male allies that are like, this is not how we're going to respond, and we're going to use our voice. And I was so proud of all the women, young and, you know, my age, that spoke out when all of this happened. And I'm so proud of the younger women who are like, this is not the way our lives are going to go. And they've been in the news, they've been in social media, like so many people have stepped up to talk about this, because we are not going to play the silent majority role anymore. If anything, everybody's woken up, and we have to be better allies, you know, to the other people of color. And we are people of color too. And so it's time for us to like step up to the table and fight for the rights of everyone, not just ourselves, but everyone. And I think that's what's different about this moment. You see, you know, the Asian American Fund starting by corporate leaders, and you see money coming into organizations that typically are underfunded. Less than 1% of philanthropic dollars fund Asian American needs. And we know that Asian Americans are not a monolith. We are like from all these different countries. We have all these different cultures, and we have a really big economic divide. And so there are real needs in our community that are often hidden by the model minority. So I think all these things are coming together, and hopefully we will start working on policy change. You know, one of the first things that happened after the Atlanta shootings was trying to get the hate crimes bill passed. And the 2 Texas senators didn't support it. And so we're like, well, what can we do? We all felt so helpless. And we're like, everybody write to your Texas senator and tell them why we want them to support this bill. And an organization called Ignite created this really easy email tool. You just put in your zip code, it drafts a letter, and like so many people sent those in. And you know what? The bill passed with their vote. And so we can do something. And I think we're just learning to flex those muscles. There was a vigil after the shootings, and, you know, a few of us went, and my friends were like, I don't know how to chant. Like, it just doesn't feel right to chant. I'm like, we're going to have to build these muscles as a community, because we need to be out there chanting, marching, and protesting for our rights.
Xiaofan, what are your thoughts about this as well? You know, as Julia was showing, oftentimes, you know, our history isn't in the classroom. In the past, certainly, Asian Americans have protested, you know, have come together, have filed lawsuits, have tried to make a change together, but we don't necessarily learn about that history. Tell us about your sense of, especially as someone who was recently born here, about how you think this history is shared with Rockville.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll speak to kind of myself, right? Because
Mhm.
before
Yes.
all this event, I actually don't know much about the Asian heritage and the history in the United States. And then I start watching the documentary on PBS, learn more about the Exclusion Act and how the Japanese are living through that kind of that period of tough time. And to me, it's eye-opening, right? And then to be able to see what they have to go through and how they were a very and still a big integral part of this society. And it gives me a lot of courage to actually see how those people have fought. And a lot of the policies and things are worked because of the Asian that stood up to build all this. And so for me, I think it's very eye-opening. I think I definitely encourage everybody to go seek out those information and educate yourself and the people around you. So because I think we can learn so much from what's happened in the history. And I think kind of to what Cynthia and Tammy was saying, I think the allyship, right, during all this and be able to see people around you that show support from whatever race and color that they are. And because in Asian American, we always treat it as this single ethnic group, but they're actually 20 plus different countries of origins, right, in Asian community. And we ourselves is such a diverse group with different backgrounds and different religious beliefs and different socioeconomic status. I think we ourselves can learn a lot from each other, right, about the culture from India, from Vietnam, from Philippines, and that we probably don't even normally get exposure to. So there's a lot of that personal connection to be able to connect with those people, to learn about the heritage that will help us to widen our perspective.
What did you learn when you were going to school? Was any of this history shared with you?
No, I think when I was went to A&M in the college, I actually did take the history, American history. Maybe it's just because I didn't pay attention in the classroom, but none of those history was really mentioned. Maybe there was one paragraph, one page, and there's nothing was really mentioned, right, in the University American History and Politics.
As we know, it's so important to learn this history early as well, like that omission of our history can lead to a sense of doubt, right? Of not understanding what our past has been. I'm curious, what do you think needs to happen right now, especially with our children and young people going through these really difficult times? How do we talk about this? Tammy?
Am I the only parent on the panel? I don't want to speak for everyone. I have a 10-year-old, an almost 9-year-old, and a 4-year-old. And as I've mentioned, this past year, we took them virtual for the sake of health precautions. And as a byproduct, it kept them safer from hearing some of these more global issues. But as they are becoming more introduced back into the world, and they'll be going back to school in the fall and camp this summer, it's a very different world than what they exited from last March. And we've had to have some tough conversations with them, at the same time balancing how to preserve their innocence and that, you know, rosy glass perspective that they have as youngsters, to still feel that people are good. And so it's been tough for us as parents to let them know that some people, including our president, have said things against people who look like us. And the questions of why that a child asks is the same question an adult would ask. But answering a child with the reason is much harder. And sometimes they don't have the answers to that. And I can only give them a solution as to, in our family, this is what we do. This is what I want you to do as your mom. I want you to treat others with respect and kindness. If someone acts in a way towards you that is unkind, I want you to give them an opportunity to correct themselves, try to remain friendly, and help them understand your perspective. If they continue to act in an ugly or unkind way to you, distance yourself. And if they bully you, that's a whole nother matter. That's when dad steps in. But for us as parents and as an individual that is raising the next generation, I had to think differently with how to combat racism, because I want them to understand that the world is not a perfect place, but it is a place that they should want to be in, and that they can make an impact on and change, and that they can feel safe with their friends, even those that don't necessarily completely understand them or where they're coming from, but to keep those friendships open, even with adults, to keep those friendships open so that you can help them understand who you are and where you're coming from, because it won't do us any good if we close ourselves off and don't share the goodness in ourselves, in our community. So it's a tough balance, because like I said, I'm kind of Pollyanna in that way, and that I have hope for everyone. But in this past year, especially on social media, many people have, in many fortunate ways, shown us their true colors. And maybe those are the friends that we don't need to be around as much. And then there are those who have come to our defense and shown that they're allies, and I appreciate that so much. And then there's a lot of in between, the people that haven't said anything, that haven't been really, either they haven't made up their mind, but the silence to me is quite deafening. And as the president said today, when he announced that the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, when he signed it into law, he said, complicity is silence. And I felt that even before, was, if you're not going to stand up for me, what are you saying by not saying? And I hope that is the same for my children and their friends, is if you see something, say something. It is the same with bullying. You need to stand up for your friends. You need to surround yourself with people who will be there for you. And if you cannot be there for me, then I would rather know it than keep you as a friend and put my trust in you. So those rules of engagement and friendship happen from a child's perspective and even as adults.
About the rest of you in terms of what you've been seeing on your own social media. It's surprising to see how people maybe respond to some of your posts or don't respond. What has that been like for you? Anna?
For me, I think it was a little bit of both. So I had people who were speaking out, and then I think there were friends who maybe weren't sure how to address the issue at hand. And it was then, and they were non-Asian friends, so they weren't fully aware of what was happening. I was very open on my social media in terms of how I was feeling, things that were happening, and just all my emotions. I was letting it out there, really kind of putting it to the world. But I do know I had friends who just didn't know how to address it. They weren't sure what to say about it, but they also did admit, I'm not familiar with the Asian American history, like what your community has gone through in the past. And it was at that point where I kind of took the stand of trying to help educate friends and anyone else who is willing to listen, just to kind of encourage them to learn about the history of Asian Americans. Like Xiaofan took it upon himself to learn about our history. I'm taking it upon myself to further educate and learn about the history for all of the ethnicities included in the Asian American community. So I think that's like a start. And that was where I was encouraging people who may have not been aware or that they didn't know what to say in particular about this. Just kind of start there. And I just took that as a starting point for myself to kind of help people learn to address or become more comfortable addressing what we're going through.
Well, Anna, when we were talking before, you were sharing some of the comments that you get sometimes when you're just out and about. Would you mind sharing those as well as you were talking about, as people may comment either about where you're from or how you speak? And let's talk about that, because that is also such a pervasive issue as well.
Yeah, growing up, I played the "Where are you from?" game a lot. Where are you really from? And when I was younger, I would just kind of joke around and never really thought much of it. But the older I got, I was like, that's kind of messed up. Like, why are you questioning where I'm from? I'm American. That answer was never good enough. So I'd have to explain where my parents were from, where they immigrated from. And then I think just kind of like the perpetual foreigner based on looks. I was on a vacation with my family. We were in Paris and we're all talking, and there's a couple next to us, and the husband kind of interrupted. It was like, wow, you guys speak English so well. Where are you from? Then my sister was just like, we're from the Bay Area, California. Oh, okay. So again, like the perpetual foreigner. And to me, like, I am heavy on Hispanic features. So if you know the history of the Philippines, we were colonized by Spain for quite some time. So we do have those features in us. And my maiden name is Rodriguez. So I was Anna Marie Rodriguez growing up. And I would literally have to defend being Filipino, because people would look at me, they'd see my name on paper and say, oh, Rodriguez, you're Mexican. And I was like, no, let me open up this history book for you and have to justify who I am to someone, to a stranger. And so those were just some things that like I had to deal with growing up, and I never knew really how to respond to them until I educated myself, and the older I got, and I just try to handle it better.
Thanks for sharing that, because I think there are people who may think, oh, they were paying you a compliment perhaps, or they were just showing interest. I'd love to hear the rest of you expound on that as well, so we can help people understand that by doing that, it really is, putting Asian American Pacific Islanders in this other category. And when you do that, when you assume that, are you really an American? It really questions whether you belong here. And if you start questioning whether you belong here, that leads to the kind of prejudice behavior we see. So your thoughts?
I work in entertainment, and I've had bosses interestingly describe me to others. One, and of course I don't work for either of these men now, thankfully, but I remember sharing with one boss that my story of coming here as a boat person with my mother. And if you're unfamiliar with what boat people are, there was a wave of refugees that came from Vietnam, some immediately after the fall of Saigon, and for almost 20 years after, but fled to America to search for a better life. And I kind of shared that story with him as a personal share. And I remember being in a client meeting, and he introduced me as Tammy, the boat person who came here on a cruise ship, because he couldn't fathom that someone like me, who dressed like me and talked like me, could ever have suffered or just had the upbringing that I had. He just assumed, oh, Tammy now is able to drive a nice car, so there's just no way. And he minimized my experience in such a demeaning way that I ended up bringing it to the vice president, and showing my concern over his insensitivity. And she called a company-wide diversity training, of which he did not attend. So, and then I had another boss who I interned for way back in LA. After I moved on from that job, another intern later told me that he had said he was sad that his fortune cookie no longer worked for him. And so it's like these strange ways of, you work so hard, especially as an Asian American female, to do your job, overdo your job, overachieve, and then how your boss ends up seeing you and talks about you is just demoralizing. And that's from a corporate perspective, from a professional perspective. To hear those things is truly heartbreaking. And that's hard to combat. It's very, very hard to combat.
Yeah, and I would just add to Tammy, like, it's more than heartbreaking. It's very traumatizing. And one of the things that we haven't touched on yet is how the Atlanta killings were an intersection of not only race, but also gender, and how Asian women in particularly have been sexualized in the media and, throughout our history. Chinese women were banned from coming to the US because they, spread disease. And they never talked to the part that they were actually trafficked, into sexual work. But they was always blaming Asian women. And that continues. And I think what those murders did was it opened up this well of repressed feelings amongst women. And that started to show up in social media. And, we have a group called Women of Asian Descent. And I think women can start, it was like that Me Too moment where then women could share, like, this has been happening to me. I didn't know what to do about it. Like, I don't know why men say these things to me on social media. Don't know why they do catcalls. I don't know why they quote films, that sexualize women. And then now we're being murdered for it. So amongst my Asian girlfriends, there are a lot of tears opening up things that they have not dared talk about, not even to their families, about how they've been treated, and continue. Like, it doesn't just happen once, it's throughout your life growing up, whether it's in school, whether it's men you date, whether it is just strangers, having all these names for us. And I think that has been, the hardest thing to watch my friends as they kind of work through the pain of what they're realizing. And we do need more support and help as a whole community to deal with this. And, that trafficking goes on now. Texas is one of the, highest ranking cities in having sex trafficking here. And, there are raids that we read about in the paper about Asian women at, being trafficked into the country for that, and all different things. So that is still like another unspoken secret in the community that no one wants to address.
Take one of the questions we have from the audience. It's, how do we fight against the misconception that Asian Americans are a monolithic group? I'd love to take that.
That's a big one. That's one that jump-started my career. In fact, I started in theater in middle school and high school, but then I quickly realized that to be in a director's chair or the producer's chair would give me a little bit more control to tell our stories. And I read a book when I was in high school that changed my life, and it was The Joy Luck Club. Later became a movie that changed many of our lives. But to be able to see myself on screen and to see stories like mine on screen completely changed my life. And I thank Amy Tan for that, and Janet Yang as well. But for me, it became the idea of a change maker and an image changer too. And I'm so glad now with Against the Grain, we have a scholarship fund, and we started it 10 years ago. And I started on the review committee for that, usually towards the latter half. And to see the amount of youth who have stepped up in not only art, but in film, they talk about how will I use my art to change the world? And it's pretty amazing to hear these young voices who are so inspiring, even to me now in my 40s, say, I want to change my art to change the perception of Asian Americans, because I want others to be able to see me as a human, that I want to belong. We have to share our stories more. And the media is a part of that. That's a bigger thing. Not everyone is equipped with a film camera and wants to be an actor or a paintbrush. You share in different ways. From a parent's perspective, like I tell my children, it's the relationship. It's the you, it's the me, it's the neighborhood, it's the community. It's the getting involved with community, not just our own community, but the greater community, to be able to connect. Because without the connection, you cannot share. People cannot understand. And we don't want to be the other, and we will become the other if we continue to just stay within our community. And it's, again, a balance, because we want to preserve who we are and celebrate our culture, but we have to be able to open that up so that other people can see that and celebrate that as well. So from a media perspective and from just a human perspective, there's a lot of sharing that has to go on.
Yeah, I would
I might
just
add-
want to, yeah, go ahead, Cynthia.
Oh, it's like we have to be part of the narrative. We have to be part of the stories. We have to be part of the vote. We have to, just be more part of everything. And I think there's a way for us to do it. Like in our Orchid Giving Circle, what we're trying to do is raise awareness of the needs out there. They're different. There are, women and children that have all different needs when they're new immigrants and when they're in domestic violence situations. We just have to raise that awareness. And I think, I really love seeing Anna's posts, because she raises awareness of her love of her culture and her food. And so we just have to be part of the story.
Yeah, I just want to echo kind of Tammy said. It resonated well with me, that human connection. I think we talk about learning from history, reading the history books, but nothing can replace the human connections, right? With especially people that are different from you. And I have a personal story just quickly to share, right? Like when I first came to the US, to A&M from China to College Station, Texas, right? As you can imagine, that culture shock. And a lot of with a broken English, no matter how much I prepare myself, watching all this Friends episode is still different, right? When you first came here. But my life has really changed quickly when I first, at a dorm gathering where I met my best friend today, Matt. He grew up in the Woodlands, he's white. And then he approached me when I was feeling in the corner, being awkward and trying to blend in other people's conversation. And so we had a great conversation. So our friendship started from a few ping pong games to taking me to his house, right, for every Thanksgiving, Christmas. And we bring my Chinese tradition to his household, and I learned about the American cultures. And then later on in 2008, his whole family went to China for the Olympic Games, where he really immersed himself in that the Chinese culture. And so I think we both widen our view in a total different world and different perspective. And I think only through that real connections that we get to talk about, understand each other's culture and each other's perspective in a much deeper way. And I think we can read all this news about the other country and what's happening between US and China, but it will help to really break down a lot of that misunderstanding and share the perspective when you actually get to talk with someone from that country. And I think that's very powerful, right? I think that against all this racism and biases, like how do you create an inclusive environment by reaching out to someone in your neighborhood, someone that you know from work, from those people? That's the best way to learn.
I think really quickly, going back to what Tammy had said in terms of like, we each need to share our stories. And I totally connected with that, because that's the essence of my pop-up Ulam. I'm sharing my culture, my background, my family, me, how I grew up, my food, and all through food. It's literally all through food. And I think food is so powerful and such a people connector that it's kind of like the gateway in terms of teaching others who are unaware. And then you just kind of bring them in. And I really do think like using our voice now and just sharing who we are unabashedly, like not being afraid. Because I do know growing up, I maybe tried to downplay or just be more American, try to fit in with the other kids at school. And I had a friend in high school and she was a quarter Filipino, but she kind of hid it. She never acknowledged it really. And we were in my car and I had something hanging up on my rearview mirror and she was like, take that down. That's so Filipino. And I was like, oh, she's like, she literally ripped it off. I was like, okay. And being in high school, you know, you just want to fit in. And I just kind of downplayed that incident. But now that I have my pop-up and I'm just reconnected back to my Filipino roots, like I am proud to say I'm Filipino. This is who I am. This is my food. And like, talk about like my family, like it's no big deal. I used to be so ashamed of the food of my white friends. Like when they came over to our house, I would kind of be like, can we just order pizza? But now I'm like, no, eat this food. And like, this is me. So I think to Tammy's point, like just 100%, like we just have to keep sharing who we are to kind of break that monolith of what Asians are.
We have some questions that center around the concept of what can allies do to help combat this Asian hate?
I think I would say go first. I think there's a lot of things you guys, everyone can do, right? I think if you're in an organization of influence, you have ability to organize more platform for people to actually speak and share their experience, like what we're doing now, right? I think it's very powerful for the community to actually hear each other that you're not alone. And then the act of showing that support that you care and come to that type of event. So in TI, it actually in last year, there's multiple of those kind of listening sessions that we came together. And personally for me, it was very helpful, right? To be able to see how many people, not just Asians and non-Asians that come and be curious about and want to learn more. So it's very powerful message. And the other things like you can host maybe events on kind of educating people on how to be upstander, how to actually speak up, because not all of us know when those things happen. There's a lot of actually resources and toolkits and things can actually help us to get more knowledgeable, right, when those things happen. So I think I would say the first thing is just educate yourself on those issues and show the empathy to the people that are different to understand the differences. And then you can start reflecting on how you can actually truly become an advocate, right, to this group of people.
We also have a question from someone that what happens if you have experienced this racist act? Where can you go for help and support?
I think that's the question that we grapple with nationally. We have a very weak infrastructure of Asian serving organizations. And, you know, we're really lucky that a group started this Stop Asian Hate site. So you can go on the website and at least report it. And there is conversations to try to build up those kinds of resources across the country. And I think that is a conversation, but I would say, if something has happened, you know, depending on how severe it is, please report it. One of the biggest issues is the underreporting of hate crimes and things like that. And then reach out to your Asian friends. I mean, we've been doing that informally with this group of women of Asian descent, just to go talk about it and do things that help us all to heal, because we're just kind of holding that inside. But I think that is something that this moment has really lifted up, is we need much better support across the country for Asians, whether it be reporting information like disaggregated data on our demographics. Who are we? Where are we? We are not just other. And then also support when things like this happen. There is Asian Americans Advancing Justice, who has been very active, you know, advocating for this bill. And they're kind of, I think, the closest we have to an an American Civil Liberties Union for Asian Americans. But we know that is an area that we can all work on to make better for everyone.
Someone else would like to comment on that, because the self-care is so important. There's so many traumatic events happening. What do the rest of you do to help heal and take care of yourselves?
Healing, I think just holding space for myself, which I'm not always the best at. But really just finding people to talk to, someone who will just let me vent. And luckily I've had friends reach out and they're like, if you just need an ear to listen, if you need a shoulder to cry on, I'm here. And then like, yeah, really just holding space for myself and taking care of me, like pulling it back and taking care of me, whether it's doing a workout or cooking. That's where I find a lot of solace, in like cooking for myself and friends and just putting that energy there. And I've even started to try meditation because my brain would just be nonstop. And I think in the world of social media, like I just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and I'm really bad at turning it off. So that's been very helpful for me to kind of like calm things down.
I wanted to address that as well as the allyship question. Being in entertainment, I feel like sometimes our art comes from our pain. And I think this holding it in, as Cynthia says, is going to turn out to create some amazing art one day, a book, a series. But what I'm glad to see in entertainment, and I'm seeing a lot of people look more towards Asian Americans for casting. My sister works for Netflix, and just this past month, she was able to help push through an amazing marketing campaign that raised awareness for Asian Americans and all the programs that they've had come out through Netflix, which we've probably all been watching for the last year. But I think that they are much more open to being an ally to the community. And I can't stress enough how important the media is to shaping our reflection as well as sharing our story. And I've even asked my friends who are casting directors who want to be allies but don't know what to do, give us an opportunity. Look at us for the roles. You're educated, you're aware, but now it's time to amplify our voices and give more Asian Americans an opportunity to be seen for more than the nurse, the doctor, the nail salon worker, a lot of roles that I've probably been auditioning for. I think it's important to find those allies. And my husband, even when he had started in the modeling industry with a very large agency here in Dallas, was told, you are not going to work in this industry because it's a very Barbie and Ken industry. And my husband is Korean. He's a very good looking Korean, I will say. But he was told he would not work. But the agent ate his words because he sent my husband on as many auditions and as many castings as he could. And it was by his personality and his personal connection, as Xiaofan had said, that personal connection with the casting director that ultimately made him one of the top Asian models in Dallas. And it was told that he would never work. So I think that opportunity to give us the opportunity to change people's minds is really important.
Well, talking about changing people's minds and the role of upstanders, our final question we'll have from our audience is, as an Asian American, how can we encourage our community to speak up for themselves and for others?
We had talked about this previously, Sylvia, and it's, I think, been really, really hard for many of us to have been locked in our homes for the last year and been more dependent on social media and what social media has done. And most of these people are friends that we know, friends you think you know. And over the last very political year, it's become more apparent as to how people believe, and people have become more vocal. And I think the easiest way to be an upstander is to, even when it's difficult, to keep those friendships going, to not block, even when you feel the need to block and unfriend, because you need them to listen, or you want, or you hope that they'll listen. And you may listen a little bit too. We all have our beliefs, but I feel like sometimes that willingness to be open is the first part, and to not blame. Why do you feel that way? Instead of asking, I wonder why they feel that way, and putting yourself in their shoes to figure out, what am I missing here? And what are they missing in return? And how can I give them a little piece of me? And how can I understand a little bit of them? That's part of it. And then the second part of it is being brave enough, because in this day and age, no time, no energy, it is hard to be brave. And for my kids, I think that's my biggest motivator, is because when I'm tired and I don't want to do it, I look at their faces and I say, this is not the world I want them to go into. If you have a niece, a nephew, if you're not a parent yet, if you have someone who's younger that you want to encourage and give hope to, then think of that. I think that will give you some hope and motivation.
Yeah, it's been really hard, even to leave the house because of some of the fears that we've had. But one of the things that's really helped me is to go for walks with friends. And I've walked with friends for years, but we've never talked about this stuff. And so one of the things that's helpful is like, you talked about earlier, like some people are just silent, that haven't said anything through this. And so finally, I've taken the opportunity to say, like, can I tell you something? This is how I feel. And I've had some friends that genuinely like don't understand. They're like, I just didn't know that Asians were treated like this, or that you feel like this, that you feel like an other, that you don't belong. And then, I've had to like take a deep breath and say, well, okay, I'm going to share you with my story, because they want to know if something's happened to me this year. And I say, like, it's not that something has happened to me this year. It's been happening my whole life. And let me share some stories of what brings me here and why I'm afraid. And so it's, it's hard to share the story. It's hard to ask somebody those things when you're like, I've been your friend for 20 years and I don't have any inkling that's how you feel, And so I had to get over myself. Like, they're not trying to make me upset. They don't understand. And then just saying, okay, my role right here. I have a moment just to share.
Yeah, I agree with Cynthia. I think it's for myself, right? I was the silent voice before. And then I think that taking that first step to speak that first conversation with someone, whether you're within your family or with friends, is the hardest step. I think once you take that step, I think it's a lot easier. And then you will find out that you are actually not alone feeling that way, and your other people also care. And I think that's really that first step, taking the courage and accumulated that courage. And a lot of that also kind of driven because of what's happening, the anger start building up, and then you become realizing that this is a real issue, right? In the past, it's a lot of apathy that was building up. It's just like, maybe this doesn't really impact me. It doesn't relate to me, but it is very as much as related to us and to everyone, right? We all stand up to confront this biases and racism.
And Anna, would you like to close for us? You are speaking up, you are engaged. How would you encourage others to do what you're doing?
I mean, I think just to kind of repeat what everyone was saying, like, be ready to have those conversations, and they're not going to be easy. They're not easy for anyone, but even if it's someone who politically or socially you might not agree with, you have differing views, but like Tammy said, keep that relationship open. And there are a couple of people who I know we don't agree on things, and I try to keep that chain of communication open so we can hear each other. Like me, I'm always willing to listen and ready to listen to what someone has to say. And I hope they're on the receiving end as well, and they're ready to listen and learn. And like, I do have friends now who are like, how are you feeling? What's going on? And like, literally, like Cynthia, they just didn't know. And that's kind of where I think I said it earlier, like kind of taking the opportunity to encourage them, like, here are some resources. They're really great resources if you really want to learn about like what the community has gone through. So you can kind of just talk to it better. So I think like having that education, or just taking the time to have the education, but also like just having those conversations, because that's really the first step of any change, I think.
Well, thank you all for this conversation this evening. Thank you, Tammy, Xiaofan, Cynthia, and Anna for sharing your voices, your stories, and your truths with us tonight. It's been an honor to be with you. And again, a special thanks to the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum for bringing us all together this evening, and for the museum's leadership in combating prejudice and hatred and indifference, and showing us all what it means to be an outstanding. So thank you, and now hand it back to you, Annette.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. And Tammy, Xiaofan, Anna, Cynthia, thank you for being so open and honest tonight. I'm so sorry to hear that you've been living in fear and worried about your family's safety. Xiaofan, when you said that this year made you question whether or not you should stay in America, that made me very sad. I appreciate all of your voices tonight to help us understand how hurtful prejudice and discrimination can be. And I personally am very grateful that you're in our community. And I hope that everyone watching tonight redoubles their effort and their resolve to be an upstander and to make sure that people don't feel this way in our community. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight. Good evening.